Welcome to the Bearded Bereans, where we analyze topics of the day in the light of the scriptures.
Man, it's so good to be on with you another night, 2 nights in a row. We are live on X and YouTube, and looking forward to another conversation. Maybe haphazard like last night. I don't know. We'll see. It could be organized. But this time, we're actually going to talk about what we're smoking first. Because yesterday, it was a quick podcast, and I thought, we'll just go ahead and move on. But I really kind of want to spend a little bit of time. I want to park here. And I want to ask, Jason Bolt, what are you smoking tonight?
Okay, so I have one of the diesels, and let's see, where's my band? I don't know where it is. It's like the light brown colored one. It's
Yeah.
right here.
Yeah, is that the uncut one?
No. It's not that, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah. You've had some
What
of
do they
these
call that
recently.
one? I don't know what they call that one. That was good. That's good, though.
I don't know what they call these either.
Very
There's
good.
a whole bunch that are similar, and they have just slightly different colored bands, and I don't know. It looks like a Maduro. It's
Slightly different
tasty.
profiles. They're not.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not wildly diverse.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. You bringing anything to drink?
Of course.
Amen.
Yes, of course.
Well, Jay, I'm bringing something that befits my personality. I am from Texas. Y'all might not understand that. I might not have said that before. Like Gabe Waterboy always starts everything with "I'm from Texas." Well, let me tell you, that's okay that he does that because Texas is the only state anybody should ever want to claim if you're from Texas. Anyway, so I am smoking a Texas Lancero. Okay. If anybody knows cigars, Lanceros are typically very small, skinny, long cigars. This is Texas size Lancero. It is at least a 60 ring gauge cigar. I have no idea what profile, what wrapper, what filler, binder. I don't know any of that stuff. I just know it said Texas on there, so I'm going to smoke it.
It said Texas, so
Does
I
it sound
bought
good
it.
to you?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
it says
great.
Texas, so I bought it. You know, that is pride in your state, okay? And that's what I would expect from any Texan. So, Gabe, Waterboy, you'll probably never watch this, but if you do, I affirm you in your Texasness.
Texasness.
Texasness, yeah. Yeah. So, anyway, I don't have my torch lighter, so I'm using a normal butane lighter.
I got one. You want to borrow it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, send it over here from Montana, would you?
Will do.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. May not have enough lighter to make this work. Here we go.
So I talked to a good friend today, very briefly, and he said, "Hey, Jason, the other day I was driving somewhere, or I was about to drive somewhere, and I thought, man, I need a good podcast. I didn't have any, and I thought, oh boy." So he pulls up the Bearded Bereans and hit refresh, and there was a new episode, and his day was made.
I'm glad, man. You know, it's not often that you get affirmed in your attempts at podcasting.
Yep, it made it all worth it.
That's
Just
great,
for him.
man. I'm glad someone wanted to join up to listen to you pontificate on whatever we're talking about. So that's
I
good.
think
That's good.
he's just being kind, actually. He probably feels bad for us.
Well, that's okay. At least someone does. Someone can feel bad for us, someone
Yeah.
can feel good for us. What's the topic for tonight? I'm sure people are dying to know at this point as I attempt to light this massive cigar.
It's
Goodness
painful.
gracious. Hmm.
Okay. Uh, I'm just going to read something here real quickly, and I think this will introduce our topic for us. So, in Ephesians 1, Paul lists off a bunch of things, um, some pretty profound things. Like in verse 4, just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us as to adoption as sons through Jesus Christ. Then he gives this like list of, um, you could call them conditions, I guess, according to the
Sure.
kind intention of his will. Um, and then later on, he says something about according to his kind intention, um, according to the great love with which he loved us. Uh, and so he's sort of talking about like the basis uh, of salvation, if you will. It starts with God and his
Mhm.
intention, his purpose. But then he also sprinkles in here what that purpose is. And this is the topic for tonight. So in verse 6, um, going back to verse 5, according to the kind intention of his will, and then verse 6, to the praise of the glory of his grace. And then you skip over to verse 13, verse 12, sort of like the end of this whole running commentary on all these wonderful acts of salvation that God has done for us. In verse 12, to the end that we who were first to hope in Christ would be to the praise of his glory. And so all of redemptive history, from before time began, when God contemplated all this in his mind and set forward a plan according to his own intention, from then all the way to culmination, it has one ultimate aim, and that aim is to the praise of his glory.
Mm.
And so you and I were sitting here earlier just talking about the nature of the glory of God and how the Reformed tradition, in my view, has the deepest and richest uh, and most glorious theology of all of Christendom. And how, when you go back to Calvin, for instance, Calvin talked about the whole world being, I'm going to paraphrase here, but the universe being a stage on which God is conducting this play as a display of his glory. Like that is the thing that he's doing. Um, you take the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 1. And there's a reason it's the first question and not the last one or the middle one or the second one. It's the first one. What is the chief end of man? Well, his chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, which, by the way, there's only one chief end by definition. A chief end is singular. And so to glorify him and to enjoy him together is the chief end. So that's an interesting conversation. Um, and so uh, the topic tonight is the glory of God and the way in which the glory of God has shaped and defined the Reformed tradition. I mean, if you read Luther's Institutes or any of his stuff, really, everything flows from the glory of God, from predestination to glorification in the end, the whole history of redemption and everything that God is doing, and our understanding of everything that God is doing, um, from his political philosophy to his view of the sacraments, all of it flows from um, this central point of God displaying his glory. And so the Reformed tradition has that core, that center, that root, that foundation, that starting point. And it seems to me that Reformed folks ought to be known by non-Reformed folks as the people of the glory of God. Right? The majesties of Christ and the glory of God ought to be the things that are on our mouth, or on our lips most often. Um, when they want to know something about the glory of God or about God's ultimate purposes or his greatest aims, they should think to themselves, well, let's go talk to a reformed person. You know, they're always talking about that kind of stuff. Like that's what we should be known for. And but sadly, it kind of seems like we're not really known for that at all. But we're more known for little squabbles and arguments over
Yeah.
smaller issues of doctrine.
I do want to say that there does seem to be a generation of reformed people. R.C. Sproul,
Yeah, yeah,
Steve Lawson pre issue. Who knows about that right now? But um, John MacArthur, who's not reformed but leans reformed, and certainly was exultant uh, in his um, in his sermons of the glory of God. There's Alistair Begg. There's all
yeah.
the Ligonier guys
Yep,
that do seem to keep that main thing
that's
main
true.
thing. Um, and I will say this: there's a certain maturity that we should take from those. I would even put Doug Wilson in that category. Wisdom, maturity, people who do extol those things and are known for extolling those things. Um, Extolling the glory of God, as beheld in the face of Christ Jesus. I have it's anecdotal, of course, but there's a non-reformed pastor that I worked for who told me that he actually appreciated reformed guys because of their extolling of the glory of God. And because of their high view of God, he appreciated them. He disagreed with them on many points of doctrine below that.
Yeah,
But he did appreciate their doctrine of God properly. So I think we've been there before. And I think there's a place in for the culture war, there's a place for, all the things that come for fighting for righteousness and things like that. But it does seem like we have failed in the last 5 years, probably since COVID. I'll say since COVID, in our fervor to be free of tyranny, to be, unshackled from the politics of old and of the nonsense of our government. Sometimes it seems like, maybe we have, um, unfortunately, let those things become the main thing. Even though the glory of God informs those things, we've seemed to have majored on those things, and I would like to see a recovering of that because every reformed person I know acknowledges the benefit, the tremendous benefit of that old guard, the R.C. Sproul's, the John MacArthur's of the, the myriad, and you talk to them, and of course, the glory of God, the holiness of God by R.C. Sproul is always going to be extolled.
yeah,
Um, there's several books there, and the way that they interacted with people are going to be extolled. But there's something about online interaction right now, um, that seems to be detracting from the glory of God, um, that we need to steer clear from. And part of that is how we're interacting with the world. Maybe, I mean, I'm okay with the serrated edge. They need to be mocked and scorned and all those games. You know, need to be pointed to Christ. Don't just leave it at mockery. Point them to Christ. How we interact with others, and this is getting back into the last podcast. What we preach on Sundays, how we interact with brothers online. Um, I think we need to get back to recovering that rich inheritance from our fathers in the faith, for lack of a better term. R.C. Sproul, Alistair Begg, things of that nature. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think so, and I appreciate you pointing out the Sproles and those folks because they are really really good. I mean, Sproul could unfold the glory of God in a 25-minute sermon way better than I could in any amount of time. He was gifted, and so
As a matter of fact, if you've never heard of R.C. Sproul, stop listening to us right now.
yeah,
Right now. Type in your search R.C. Sproul, Holiness of God, and just feast. Feast. That is a steak, nice, juicy fillet for you to eat. Because,
yeah,
man, those sermons, formative for me, formative obviously for many Reformed Christians.
yeah.
Um, how do we recover that, Jay? How do we recover that?
Well, you touched on two things that I think maybe are important. The one of them you kind of talked about this pendulum swing, and maybe it started with COVID, or maybe sort of solidified with COVID, where um, we suddenly were faced with a great amount of tyranny and and numerous other things, and our focus went to that like right away, and it was like, wow, there's a battle right here that we need to fight, and some folks fought it well, but I think maybe
Yes.
the focus became too much on that. Um, like I've had conversations with folks outside of the reformed world that when COVID came along, uh, they kind of took it as, well, yeah, we should be concerned about government overreach, but we should be more concerned about sin in our own lives. And there's truth to that, obviously. Um, but it became like this, like two sides where we could almost say, well, we need to be more concerned about sin in our own life. Therefore, we aren't concerned at all about government tyranny, which I think is not a good view. Or because of that, we're like, wow, we've got to be so focused on government tyranny and calling it out that we end up sort of forgetting about the sin in our own life. So I think that's maybe part of what has happened, where we see these cultural battles, um, as the place where like the battle, um,
Yeah.
and it really isn't. It's a
Guilty as charged way.
what's that?
Yeah, I'm guilty of that.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah, there was certainly a vehemence that I reacted to,
yeah,
and hostile relationships, to that tyranny, and you're hitting on a good point. Toby Sumpter had a talk. I think it was 2020 actually at a Fight Laugh Feast conference, and the talk was on specifically resisting tyranny. But his first point, and I think his ending point, was that we must resist the tyranny of our own heart first.
yeah, yep,
We must kill sin first. And I mean, Toby Sumpter, I will tell you, I mean, I love the man. I have, whatever disagreements with him. I mean, why is it that whenever we have to bring a preacher up, we have to say, well, I have my disagreements with him, but Um, screw that. No, I love that man. He's a preacher of the gospel, and he gets a ton of things right. And that is a fantastic sermon. I think he's one of the preeminent preachers of our day that many people don't even know. But that sermon is super helpful in this discussion specifically. Obviously, there's a tyranny in here we've got to conquer before we can even think of conquering tyranny outside of us. Other authorities that are usurping God's rule and power. Um, so I guess that's a good thing. I asked how do we recover that, and you kind of go to that killing the tyranny, subduing the tyranny
yep,
in our own hearts. But um, how does that help us towards recovering the glory of God in our theology, in our everyday understanding, and recovering really as the lens by which we view not only the
yeah,
scriptures but the world?
yeah. Well, I said I had two things. That was the first one. This is the second one. Um, I think one of the other things that has happened, and this probably happens in every theological tradition, I don't know, but I think it certainly has, at least to a degree, in the Reformed tradition, is that because we have such a great cloud of witnesses around us, and such a wonderful history and tradition, and such wonderful institutions that have been able to theologize for several centuries now. Um, we have a lot of just really great, we have an incredible library. And so I think what happens is, because Reformed theology is superior to every other Christian tradition, in my opinion, we end up studying the theology rather than the God behind the theology. And so, we'll end up reading Bavinck for however long and getting down into these nitty gritty little details, in thinking that that's going to make us really reformed. If I can quote Bavinck, then, I, then I'm truly reformed, um, in doing that, instead of focusing our attention first on the glory of God. And I'm going to read from Second Corinthians here, because this is, you asked, how do we get back to that, and have the glory of God as the lens through which we see things, and like the starting point of our theology, and how do we get back to the glory of God in such a way that changes us, so that we do kill the sin and the tyranny in our own hearts first, before we go after it in other places. And I think this is the answer. So 2 Corinthians chapter 3, he's talking about the ministry of the old covenant and the ministry of the new covenant. And I'm not going to read all these verses here, but I'll start in verse 12. In verse 18 is really the important one. Therefore, having such a hope, we use great boldness in our speech, and are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away, but their minds were hardened. For until this very day, at the reading of the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because it is removed in Christ. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. It's actually verse 18 is where I'm going. Now, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Now, here's the important part. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord the Spirit. And so what's happening here is, beholding the glory of God, we are transformed. The transformation of the Christian, the sanctification of the Christian, the changing of our hearts and of the renewing of our minds, and the killing of sin and our own tyranny, happens when we behold the glory of the Lord. We're actually changed into the image that we see. That is the way in which we're conformed into the image of Christ, is by beholding his glory. And you read other places, the glory displayed in the cross, and it's not by studying Bavinck that we are sanctified. Right? You should read him; he's good. But if you just read him for the sake of reading him, and you're not beholding the glory of Christ in what he's saying, there's no point to it. In fact, it might actually be counterintuitive. That's not the right word. Counter, whatever. It might have the opposite impact.
Yeah. Yeah, it may be detrimental. So Bavinck and Burkhoff and Frame and Grudem and underline whatever author here can be a means by which you view Christ. But you can also seek understanding for understanding's sake, and not to understand the object of your understanding, which is Christ,
Right.
which is God. And so when we move our focus from God proper and then move it to the study of God, which is practically what you just said, we're failing to apprehend that which will transform us into the likeness of God. And so, we need to, you hear this cliche all the time. I've already used it once, and I think we used it before we were talking, keeping the main thing the main thing. It's the glory of God that transforms us into the likeness of God. So how do we see, how do we behold the glory of God? We do that through the reading, understanding, the worshiping of that God. And so I think the principle here is whenever you're reading theology and it doesn't move you to worship the God that you are studying, you're missing the whole point.
Yeah.
Good theology should always move you to doxology. And that doxology, that beholding of God's glory, that extolling of who He is, that worship of the Creator should transform you into His image and into His likeness. Um, so that's good. That's one thing. I think that's right. I think that's the first thing. That's the initial thing. That's where Reformed people get it wrong. Point one. But I think there's a point two as well. It's not just those that read theology. I think it's also those that take that theology and they want to quibble about a certain point of doctrine in that theology with other Christians. I think that happens a lot, which
Yeah.
goes into what we were talking about last podcast. Is that fair? Is that subsumed under what you were just saying, or is that another point entirely?
Well, I mean, I think obviously if we just beheld the glory of Christ, um, that we wouldn't quibble over little points of doctrine. But uh, I, so maybe it's a sub point, maybe it's a point all on its own. But no, I think you're exactly right. Where we somehow lose the vision of the glory of God in the face of Christ, and think that it consists of these little points of doctrine, and so then we rightfully put a lot of value in these little points of doctrine, and we argue over them, and we get into the weeds, um, and uh, it's how do I put this? It's really it's like moving from a lush garden in a jungle out into the desert when that happens. And I say that having spent time in lush gardens in
Mhm.
jungles and times in deserts, and in my own life. um, there's cycles of life in, just in terms of the Christian life and our sanctification. And there's times in my own life that I have this view of the glory of God in the face of Christ, and it informs everything, all of my thoughts, all of my actions, everything that I do. Um, and there's times when not so much.
Yeah. Mm.
The not so much times aren't as good.
So, so how do we move from the desert back to the jungle? I mean, obviously, it starts with repentance and seeing where we've been wrong. And don't hear us say that there's not a point for theological debate, scholarly debate, disputation, all those things we affirm, and that is a good means of inquiry into understanding God more rightly.
Yeah.
But that's not often what's going on. Um, that's not what often is going on online. It's not often what's going on in sermons where we move to extolling a specific doctrine over and over and over again at the expense of the glory of God proper. Uh, I have another pastor. I learned a lot from this man. He's a good man. Um, but he talks about pastors going to seed on a specific issue. Have you ever heard that terminology, Jay? Going to seed on
No.
something?
No.
So his idea was say a brand new Calvinist pastor, right? He just came to Calvinism. He's cage stage. He's already a pastor, and he preaches Calvinism over and over and over and over again. That's a seed on that issue. Um, and that's definitely possible with Calvinists. We all know them and love them, and are irritated by them um, from time to time. I say that as a Calvinist. A fat dude can make fun of fat people, right? I say that as a Calvinist, can make fun of Calvinists, okay? So no, my point is that there are certain issues within the Reformed tradition that people can tend to go to seat on, like their particular view of baptism. It
Yep.
informs everything that they do,
Yep.
and they preach it, week in, week out, or their particular view of um, the cessation of gifts. I mean, weirdly enough, there's non-cessationist Reformed pastors, or their particular view on uh, communion or what have you. Sacrifice is a big one. Um, we export pastors to say, look, it's okay that you hold these views, but how can if you're going to seed on them, you're missing the entire point of the scriptures. I've heard many of people go in and man, the liturgy was good, the ministry of the word was lacking.
Yeah.
Liturgy was good, ministry of the word was lacking. Why? Because Christ wasn't really mentioned. You know, faithfulness was mentioned, all those things were mentioned, but what's Christ? Um, how do we exhort pastors to preach? How do we preach Christ and Christ crucified?
Well, other than just saying preach Christ and Christ crucified, so I was at a conference, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, and I don't even remember who the guy was who was uh, giving this talk. I think it was a pastor's conference, and so the guy's talking about preaching and the relationship between preaching and worship. And I don't remember anything else that he said, but he gave this analogy, and I think this analogy is really really good and is maybe an answer to your question. He said that he believes his job, well, I'll speak in first person. So this is what he said. He said, I believe that my job as a preacher is to essentially greet the people at the door, metaphorically, and take them into the throne room of God and present God before them so that they see him and are drawn to worship him. And he said this was his, in every sermon he preached, that was his objective. Um, and so I think that that would be my first encouragement, because I think it has to start with our leadership and the way in which our elders teach. If they teach with that kind of a mindset, um, and the people are met at the door and brought into the throne room of God and shown God, behold your God, um, then that is the mindset that they will have.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. So that's entirely consistent with the covenant renewal idea of worship, which obviously we have some issues with some of that, but um, the idea is that, as Hebrews says, we are ascending the mountain of God, and we are brought into His presence, and we are called into His presence, not brought into. We're called into His presence. We worship Him. We're consecrated before Him, and then we confess, we're consecrated, and then we're commissioned to go forward, right, and worship Him, or practice what we have heard. We're commissioned to live for Him, and that does seem consistent with that. So, uh, what I think, was it Spurgeon? There was a preacher that was talking about some about Hebrews. One of the elders in one of their meetings said, you know, um, all we want is Christ.
Mm.
Give us Christ. That's what we want. We want Christ. And seeing as how that's consistent with the Holy Spirit's ministry in a church, pastors should be preaching Christ, exalting Christ, exhorting people to faithful obedience to Christ. Where do we see? I mean, we've already kind of talked about, we see people going to seed and all those things. But what are some of the pitfalls that some reformed might fall into that we have not yet discussed in maybe missing Christ altogether? Yeah. Is there some other pitfalls that we should be careful of? We should watch out for
Well, what
as
do you mean
pastors.
by pitfalls? And are you referring to pastors or folks in the congregation?
One of each, right? So as a pastor, I set out my ministry early to preach Christ crucified, and I may sidetracked and I no doubt get a little in preaching faithfulness to Christ that I kind of miss Christ with. Go legalism and out, we can go whichever way you
Well, let me just say this. I don't know if this is an answer to your question or not. I say this to my students all the time because we often end up talking about this very topic, not how Reformed people screw things up, but the glory of God and how it's central to everything. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the doctrine of God and who God is, and I often take my students back to before time began, before God created anything, and I'll ask them, does God have infinite capacities for joy? And they'll answer, yes, he does. Okay, good. So we'll set that over here. We've established that. All right, good. So is God self-sufficient? Meaning he doesn't depend on anything outside of himself. Yes, he's self-sufficient. The doctrine of God's aseity. Okay, all right. So God's totally self-sufficient. So he has no wants, essentially. Okay, so he's not lacking anything. All right. If he's not lacking anything, he has no wants, then that means that he's satisfied. Okay. And if he's satisfied, then that means that his infinite capacities for joy are satisfied. Okay. So whatever it is that he's enjoying must be like really enjoyable in order to fill up infinite capacities for joy. And then I'll ask them, what is there for him to enjoy? And they give random answers here and there, but obviously the answer is there isn't anything else other than him. He's the only being who exists before time began, before he created anything else. And so what that tells us is that God has infinite capacities for joy, and he's infinitely satisfied in himself, which tells us that he's infinitely enjoyable. And so, I would just say, as a preacher, if you are tired of preaching on the joyous nature or enjoyable nature of God and his glory, you've missed something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think,
yeah,
I think it gets old to us, honestly. Okay, yeah, we talk about the glory of God. Okay, we kind of got that down, and now we need to talk about these other things. And I actually heard it said to me at one time, I don't know, 10 years ago, by a pastor friend of mine, that you need to get away from this, glory of God stuff. That's like the milk. You need to get onto the meat
yeah,
of these other reformed doctrines. And that's totally backwards in my view.
right.
If we're tired of the glory of God, the problem is with us, not with him. And we need to pray that our capacities to see him as he really truly is, we need to pray and ask that those capacities be enlarged, because they're obviously shriveled and pathetic.
So a couple things. One, the milk of the word is specifically defined as the doctrines of the laying on of hands and repentance from dead works, of washings, of things like that. It has nothing to do with the glory of God proper. The glory of God, understanding who God is the meat of the word. That's the
Yes.
point.
Yes.
Um, yeah, I think you answered the question that I was asking pretty clearly. Um, what pitfalls can we avoid? No. Um, we're talking about expounding, explaining, explicating a God that is so far beyond our ability to grasp that there should never be room for a lack of awe and ceaseless wonder and praise. And so, we talked about the doxology bit a little bit earlier. All theology should lead you to doxology, otherwise you're doing it wrong. Um, you're doing it wrongly. Um, and boredom should not be a thing. And so I think there can be a problem where in some reform circles it can become overly academic and be a little boring to the average everyday layman. Um, we need to be exciting and whipping up passions for God, and not artificially so, but because of God is who He is and explaining who He is. I think that's really kind of what I was getting at, especially with the legalism idea
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that's really good. So
Hey, can I
I
say something
almost,
real
I almost
quick?
think that we should do an attributes of God. I know everybody does that, but go ahead.
I just want to say this real quick because uh, this morning, today's Sunday, this morning in our church service, uh, just a little shout out to Pastor Ted. All right. Um, he was in John 17 and then in
Mm,
Galatians 4. And he's talking about the incarnation. And he was going through just this magnificent description of the person of Christ, um, sort of taking the Chalcedonian definition and explaining it in sort of layman's terms. Um, and it was just so he was painting this really beautiful picture. And then he goes, now I don't want you to check out here. Okay. You stay with me because this is really good. And I thought, who's going to check out here? Like of all
mm,
the places to
mm.
check out, this is not the place where I want to. No, like there's maybe other places I would check out, but not here. And
Yeah, Jay's like, I'm on the edge of my seat. What are you talking about? Check out. Yeah.
so no, it was great. And so just a shout out to him for doing that. It's he's going through this series on the doctrine of Christ for Advent, um, and that has been really really nice. Um,
Yeah.
so, anyways, that's all I had to say. Just a shout out to Ted for doing that.
Well, I mean, I can't let you do a shout out to your pastor without me doing a shout out to mine. I mean, is that fair? We can
Yeah.
do shout out for shout out. So, Pastor Justin has been preaching through Zephaniah this Advent season, and it is phenomenal. Uh, I told him last week I only dozed off once, so um, just kidding. No, just his understanding and ability to relate that to us in a way that we can actually see what God's plan is in redeeming a people for Himself. And His plan was not only for the Jews but also for the Gentiles. And um, eh, people sometimes will ask me, "Well, how was church today? How was Lord's Day?" And my answer lately has always been, well, the Lord was glorified, the Lord was exalted,
Yeah.
fellowship was had, bread was broken, wine was drunk. Um, it was a good day. It was a good Lord's Day, and largely that's due to His exemplifying a lot of what we're talking about today. Um, you know, no pastor's perfect, but he does a good job of glorifying God and um, extolling him to his people. That's another thing too. I mean, one of the things that we do on our podcast, and Max is a big reason. I think I think he does this generally just in conversation with us, where he'll be thinking about something. I mean, you've experienced this, or you've probably experienced this before, but he'll be thinking of something, some aspect of doctrine, some point, whatever, and he'll just break into doctrine sentence. Have you felt that from Max? It's pretty
Yeah, yeah,
cool.
of course, yeah,
I've had a listener actually tell me that they like that about him. I haven't told Max that because I don't want him to, think that he's all that in
yeah.
a bag of potato chips.
Don't
But
don't tell him that.
I won't tell him that. But that is something that I would like to model in my own life when I'm thinking about things like, man, because that's what Paul did. Paul's writing a letter, and then, halfway through the letter, he just breaks out into doxology. Oh, the unsearchable riches of Christ. Like, um, uh, we should do that, and I think that's indicative of someone who does theology correctly. Does
Yeah,
theology right. And doing theology correctly doesn't mean you're right on everything. It means that whatever you're studying brings you to worship, brings you to praise, brings you to
right.
to glorify God and enjoying Him forever. We talked about the first catechism question, Westminster.
Yep.
The answer is to enjoy, to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So our glorifying God should be followed by, not followed by, it should be, um, glorifying God should be accompanied by glorifying. John Piper, he changes it a little bit. I don't know if you've heard of this, but
Yeah,
glorify God by enjoying Him
yeah,
forever. So in our enjoyment of Him, we glorify Him.
yep.
Um, I think that's a worthy addition, contribution to that question, actually.
Well, I think so too. Because, like I said in the beginning, a chief end by definition is singular. So it's not as though
Hmm.
we glorify him and then we also do this other thing, which is enjoying him. It's one
Yeah.
thing, and our glorifying him is embodied by our enjoying him. Because the things that we enjoy, those are the things that we value. You know, we're made for joy. Now I'm sounding like Piper, of course, but that's okay. Um, like we're literally
You got to do
made.
your hands. Do the Piper hands.
I
Yeah.
got to gesticulate in ways that don't necessarily correlate to what I'm saying. Okay. No, I love Piper. He's served me really well over the years. Anyways, we're made to be satisfied, and when I ask my students too. Okay, so God is. This is like the next logical question. So God's infinitely satisfied in Himself. Why in the world would He make you? and
Right.
and of course they want to say, well, because he wanted to have relationship with us. No, but you already said he didn't have any wants. So it's not like he's sitting around going,
Right.
gosh, I really wish there was someone here with me, oh, gosh, I'm kind of lonely. um, no, he created you so that you could enjoy him just as much as he enjoys him. And
Yeah. Yeah.
in doing that, we are declaring how great and awesome and wonderful that
Worthy.
he
Yeah.
and worthy and valuable that he is.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so I like the way the Piper puts that. Chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying Him forever. I think it's true.
Mm, it is true. It is most certainly true. As Luther's commentary on the Creed says, these things are most certainly true.
Yeah,
Oh. Hmm. So, how would you? I mean, there's several different types of listeners. There's listeners that don't really do theology, that they're just kind of interested in this, and there's those that are, pretty well read. They've read some theology. They have been excited at times, and maybe some of them are in academic pursuits, theologically. What would be a good exhortation for all of listeners from the beginning to the advanced to the old hat?
yeah. I would say have a working definition of glory. Know what it is. Okay. Um, so there's this great book, All That Is in God by Dolezal, I think is the last name.
Yeah,
Um,
Dolezal. Yeah.
yeah. Oh man. it's a short book. It's probably only a couple hundred
That the
pages.
impassibility of God. Yeah.
Yes. Man, it's really, really good and deals a lot with this question of what is the glory of God and how does it relate to all of his attributes. Man, it's really good. So if you're interested in a really meaty, I mean, it's academic, but incredibly practical also because it can't not be.
Hmm.
Boy, that's a great read. Other than that, though, I would say two things. One, when you read the scriptures, look for the way in which the scriptures talk about the glory of God and how the glory of God is related to everything else around it.
Yeah.
If you just look for those relationships, you'll start to see what Paul says there in Ephesians 1, that everything is moving towards the glory of God. Um, so that would be my first thing. And my second thing is, and maybe this isn't for everybody, but I don't care. Read it anyways. It is for everybody. So Jonathan Edwards has this wonderful essay, which I'm sure that you've heard of. Um, it's all his stuff has like a paragraph long title, right? It's
Title. Yeah.
a
Puritans are
dis
like that.
a dissertation on the end for which God created the world. I think is the short
Yes.
title.
Yeah.
Okay, uh, give that thing a read, um,
Yeah.
and it will alter the way that you see the universe for the better.
Yes.
It will help you have this
Yeah.
perspective of not. It's a perspective that's really got two facets to it. The one is that everything is moving towards the glory of God, and the other one is what exactly is that, and what does that look like in my life? And that looks like me being transformed into the image of Christ by beholding the glory of God. Um, so yeah, I would say those two things. Look for the way the scriptures deal with God's glory, and read some Edwards. So you could probably read anything
Yeah.
of
I think those.
Edwards, and it would be good enough.
Yeah. I mean, Edwards broke down weeping in just thinking about the Trinity. So this man exemplified exactly what we're talking about, this idea of appreciating and worshiping God through theology. So I've got two books also. Those were excellent. Read both of them. Um, so there's two that I would point to. One would be popular level Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul. That's definitely a must. And then second is The Existence and Attributes of God by Charnock, Stephen Charnock. Fantastic book. I was turned on to that by John MacArthur about 8-9 years ago. It was in a question and answer session. Someone was asking him largely around the same lines that we're talking about. Any books that he would recommend around these ideas. And his statement about that was, "I've never read a man who has thought as deeply
Hmm.
as Charnock has thought about God." Um, and so it's really a meaty book, just like Jonathan Edwards' essay. Very meaty, very very difficult to work through, very worth your time and your
Yep.
efforts.
Yep.
So definitely something that you should read. So
So I have not read
well,
that work.
cool.
I have not read that work by Charnock, but it's on my shelf.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I have to
Mm.
pick it up and read
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had the Kindle version. I read it about 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, it took a while for me to work through it, but it's very, you know, very beneficial to your walk, very beneficial to your understanding. So, at any rate, man, I think that was a good, good discussion. Any other thoughts before we leave our listeners to go on to their reading and
Well, I mean,
theological inquiry?
it makes me think of um, the Spurgeon quote about smoking a cigar to the glory of God. Um,
Yeah.
but because of my view of God's glory and how everything is flows to and from that. Okay, literally all of the creation is designed to display God's manifold perfections,
For
including,
from him, through him, and to him are
yeah,
all things.
yes, all
Yeah.
things, um, including enjoying this little stick here as a gift from him. And so we can sit here and have a
Yes.
conversation about whatever we did over the weekend and enjoy this. And it can be for the glory of God when we have the right perspective. And that's a really wonderful thing. It
Yeah.
makes life so meaningful and enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very good. It completely radicalizes, changes how you go through everyday life. So
Yep.
that's very good. Well, dear listener, until next time, maybe at some point next week we'll come back live to you. But what is it that Max says? As he
The
say?
Lord be with you all. I don't know what he
The
says.
Lord be with you all. In heavy Russian accent. All right. Thanks for listening. We look forward to our next talk with you.
Kings who fight against my Lord shall taste his wrath and meet his sword upon